I'm sorry, I missed a couple of days, so we're falling behind now. Well, we better catch up. This is part 4 of Good Omens. Let's do it. Mr. Young had not been too keen on Damien, or Wormwood, or any of Sister Mary Loquacious's other suggestions, which had covered half of hell and most of the golden years of Hollywood. Well, she said finally, a little hurt, I don't think there's anything wrong with Errol or Carey. Very nice American names, both of them. I had fancied something more, well, traditional, explained Mr. Young. We've always gone in for good, simple names in our family. Sister Mary beamed. That's right. The old names are always the best, if you ask me. A decent English name, like people had in the Bible, said Mr. Young. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, he said speculatively. Sister Mary winced. Only they've never struck me as very good Bible names, really, Mr. Young added. They sound more like cowboys and footballers. Saul's nice, said Sister Mary, making the best of it. I don't want something too old-fashioned, said Mr. Young. Or Cain. Very modern sound, Cain, really, Sister Mary tried. Mr. Young looked doubtful. Or there's always Adam, said Sister Mary. That should be safe enough, she thought. Adam, said Mr. Young. It would be nice to think that the Satanist nuns had the surplus baby B, discreetly adopted, that he grew to be a normal, happy, laughing child, active and exuberant, and after that grew further to become a normal, fairly contented adult. And perhaps that's what happened. Let your mind dwell on his junior school prize for spelling, his unremarkable though quite pleasant time at university, his job as at the payroll department of the Tadfield and Norton Building Society, his lovely wife. Possibly you would like to imagine some children and a hobby, restoring vintage motorcycles perhaps, or breeding tropical fish. You don't want to know what could happen to baby B. We like your version better anyway. He probably wins prizes for his tropical fish. In a small house in Dorking, Surrey, a light was on in a bedroom window. Newt Pulsifer was 12 and thin and bespectacled, and he should have been in bed hours ago. His mother, though, was convinced of her child's genius and let him stay up past his bedtime and do his experiments. His current experiment was changing a plug on an ancient Bakelite radio his mother had given him to play with. He sat at what he proudly called his worktop, a battered old table covered in curls of wire, batteries, little light bulbs, and a homemade crystal set that had never worked. He hadn't managed to get the Bakelite radio working yet either, but then again, he never seemed able to get that far. 3 slightly crooked metal aeroplanes hung on cotton cords from his bedroom ceiling. Even a casual observer would have seen that they were made by someone who was both painstaking and very careful, and also no good at making model airplanes. He was hopelessly proud of all of them, even the Spitfire, which he'd made rather a mess of the wings. He pushed his glasses back up to the bridge of his nose, squinting down at the plug, and put down the screwdriver. He had high hopes for it this time. He had followed all the instructions on plug changes on page 5 of the Boy's Own Book of Practical Electronics, including 101 safe and educational things to do with electricity. He had attached the correct colour-coded wires to the correct pins. He'd checked that it was the right amperage fuse. He'd screwed it all back together. So far, no problems. He plugged it in the socket. Then he switched the socket on. Every light in the house went out. Newton beamed with pride. He was getting better. Last time he'd done it, he'd blacked out the whole of Dorking, and a man from the electric had come over and had a word with his mum. He had a burning and totally unrequited passion for things electrical. They had a computer at school, and 6 studious children stayed on after school doing things with punched cards. That kind of dates the book a bit, doesn't it? When the teacher in charge of the computer had finally acceded to Newton's pleas to be allowed to join them, Newton had only ever got to feed one little card in the machine. It had chewed it up and fatally choked on it. Newton was certain that the future was in computers, and when the future arrived, he'd be ready, in the forefront of the new technology. The future had its own ideas on this. It was all in the book. Adam, thought Mr. Young. He tried saying it to see how it sounded. Adam. He stared down at the golden curls of the adversary, destroyer of kings, angel of the bottomless pit, great beast that is called dragon, prince of this world, father of lies, spawn of Satan, and lord of darkness. You know, he concluded after a while, I think he actually looks like an Adam. It had not been a dark and stormy night. The dark and stormy night occurred 2 days later, about 4 hours after both Mrs. Dowling and Mrs. Young and their respective babies had left the building. It was a particularly dark and stormy night, and just after midnight, as the storm reached its height, a bolt of lightning struck the convent of the Chattering Order, setting fire to the roof of the vestry. No one was badly hurt by the fire, but it went on for some hours, doing a fair amount of damage in the process. The instigator of the fire lurked on a nearby hilltop and watched the blaze, tall, thin, and a duke of hell. It was the last thing that needed to be done before his return to the nether regions, and he had done it. He could safely leave the rest to Crowley. Hastur went home. Technically, Aziraphale was a principality, but people made jokes about that sort of thing these days. On the whole, neither he nor Crowley would have chosen each other's company, but they were both men, or at least men-shaped creatures of the world, and the arrangement had worked to their advantage all this time. Besides, you grow accustomed to the only other face that had been around more or less consistently for 6 millennia. The arrangement was very simple, so simple that it didn't really deserve the capital letter, which it had got for simply being in existence so long. It was the sort of sensible arrangement that many isolated agents, working in awkward conditions a long way from their superiors, reach with their opposite number when they realize that they have more in common with their immediate opponents than they have with their remote allies. It meant a tacit non-interference in certain of each other's activities. It made certain that while neither really won, also neither really lost, and both were able to demonstrate to their masters the great strides they were making against a cunning and well-informed adversary. It meant that Crowley had been allowed to develop Manchester, while Aziraphale had had free hand in the whole of Shropshire. Crowley took Glasgow, Aziraphale had Edinburgh. Neither claimed any responsibility for Milton Keynes, but both reported it as a success. Footnote on Milton Keynes. Note for Americans and other aliens. Milton Keynes is a new city approximately halfway between London and Birmingham. It was built to be modern, efficient, healthy, and, all in all, a pleasant place to live. Many Britons find this amusing. And then, of course, it had seemed even natural that they should, as it were, hold the fort for one another whenever common sense dictated. Both were of angel stock, after all. If one was going to hull for a quick temptation, it made sense to nip across the city and carry out a standard brief moment of divine ecstasy. It'd get done anyway, and being sensible about it gave everyone more free time and cut down on expenses. Aziraphale felt the occasional pang of guilt about this, but centuries of association with humanity was having the same effect on him as it was on Crowley, except in the other direction. Besides, the authorities didn't seem to care much who did anything, as long as it got done. Currently, what Aziraphale was doing was standing with Crowley by the duck pond in St. James's Park. They were feeding the ducks. The ducks in St. James's Park are so used to being fed bread by secret agents meeting clandestinely that they have developed their own Pavlovian reaction. Put a St. James's Park duck in a laboratory cage and show it a picture of 2 men, one usually wearing a coat with a fur collar, the other something sombre with a scarf, and it'll look up expectantly. The Russian cultural attache's black bread is particularly sought after by the more discerning duck, while the head of MI9's soggy Hovis and Marmite is relished by the connoisseurs. Aziraphale tossed a crust to a scruffy-looking drake, which caught it and sank immediately. The angel turned to Crowley. "Really, my dear," he murmured. "Sorry," said Crowley. "I was forgetting myself." The duck bobbed angrily to the surface. "Of course, we knew something was going on," Aziraphale said. "But one somehow imagines this sort of thing happening in America. They go in for that sort of thing over there." "It might yet do, at least. It might yet do at that," said Crowley gloomily. He gazed thoughtfully across the park at the Bentley, the back wheel of which was being industriously clamped. "Oh, yes, the American diplomat," said the angel. "Rather showy, one feels, as if Armageddon was some sort of cinematographic show that you wish to sell in as many countries as possible." "Every country," said Crowley. "The earth and all the kingdoms thereof." Aziraphale tossed the last scrap of bread to the ducks, who went off to pester the Bulgarian naval attaché and a furtive-looking man in a Cambridge tie, and carefully disposed of the paper bag in a waste-paper bin. He turned and faced Crowley. "We'll win, of course," he said. "You don't know that," said the demon. "Why not, pray?" "Listen," said Crowley, desperately. "How many musicians do you think your side have got, eh? First grade, I mean." Aziraphale looked taken aback. "Well, I should think," he began. "Two," said Crowley. "Elgar and Liszt. That's all. We've got all the rest. Beethoven, Brahms, all the Bachs, Mozart, the lot. Can you imagine an eternity with Elgar?" Aziraphale shut his eyes. "All too easily," he groaned. "That's it, then," said Crowley, a gleam of triumph. He knew Aziraphale's weak spot all right. "No more compact discs, no more Albert Hall, no more proms, no more Glyndebourne, just celestial harmonies all day long." "Ineffable," Aziraphale murmured. "Like eggs without salt, you said. Which reminds me, no salt, no eggs. No gravlax with dill sauce. No fascinating little restaurants where they know you. No Daily Telegraph crossword. No small antique shops. No bookshops either. No interesting old editions. No—" Crowley scraped the bottom of Aziraphale's barrel of interests. "Regency silver snuff boxes." "But after we win, life will be better," croaked the angel. "But it won't be as interesting. Look, you know I'm right. You'd be as happy with a harp as I'd be with a pitchfork. You know we don't play harps." "And we don't use pitchforks. I was being rhetorical." They stared at one another. Aziraphale spread his elegantly manicured hands. "My people are more than happy for it to happen, you know. It's what it's all about, you see. The great final test. Flaming swords, the 4 horsemen, seas of blood, the whole tedious business." He shrugged. "And then game over, insert coin," said Crowley. "Sometimes I find your methods of expression a little difficult to follow." "I like the seas as they are. It doesn't have to happen. You don't have to test everything to destruction just to see if you made it right." Aziraphale shrugged again. "That's ineffable wisdom for you, I'm afraid." The angel shuddered and pulled his coat around him. Grey clouds were piling up over the city. "Let's go somewhere warm," he said. "You're asking me?" said Crowley glumly. They walked in sombre silence for a while. "It's not that I disagree with you," said the angel, as they plodded across the grass. "It's just that I'm not allowed to disobey. You know that." "Me too," said Crowley. Aziraphale gave him a sidelong glance. "Oh, come now," he said. "You're a demon after all." "Yeah, but my people are only in favour of disobedience in general terms. It's specific disobedience they come down on heavily. Such as disobedience to themselves." "You've got it. You'd be amazed. Or perhaps you wouldn't be. How long do you think we've got?" Crowley waved a hand at the Bentley, which unlocked its doors. The prophecies differ, said Aziraphale, sliding into the passenger seat, certainly until the end of the century, although we may expect certain phenomena before then. Most of the prophets of the past millennium were more concerned with scansion than accuracy. Crowley pointed at the ignition key. It turned. What? He said. You know, said the angel helpfully. And the world unto an end shall come in Tumpty 1, or 2, or 3, or whatever. There aren't many good rhymes for 6, so it's probably a good year to be in. And what sort of phenomena? Two-headed calves, signs in the sky, geese flying backwards, showers of fish, that sort of thing. The presence of the Antichrist affects the natural operation of causality. Crowley put the Bentley in gear. Then he remembered something. He snapped his fingers. The wheel clamps disappeared. Let's have lunch, he said. I owe you one from... when was it? Paris, 1793, said Aziraphale. Oh, yes, the Reign of Terror. Was that one of yours or one of ours? Wasn't it yours? I can't recall. It was quite a good restaurant, though. As they drove past an astonished traffic warden, his notebook spontaneously combusted, to Crowley's amazement. I'm pretty certain I didn't mean to do that, he said. Aziraphale blushed. That was me, he said. I always thought that your people invented them. Did you? We thought they were yours. Crowley stared at the smoke in the rearview mirror. Come on, he said. Let's do the Ritz. Crowley had not bothered to book. In his world, table reservations were things that happened to other people. Aziraphale collected books. If he were totally honest with himself, he would have to admitted that his bookshop was simply somewhere to store them. He was not unusual in this. In order to maintain his cover as a typical second-hand bookseller, he used every means short of actual physical violence to prevent customers from making a purchase. Unpleasant damp smells, glowering looks, erratic opening hours, he was incredibly good at it. He had been collecting for a long time, and like all collectors, he specialized. He had more than 60 books of predictions concerning developments in the last handful of centuries of the second millennium. He had a penchant for wild first editions, and he had a complete set of infamous Bibles, individually named from errors in typesetting. These Bibles included the Unrighteous Bible, so called from a printer's error which caused it to proclaim in 1 Corinthians, Know ye not that the unrighteous shall inherit the kingdom of God? And the Wicked Bible, printed by Barker and Lucas in 1632, in which the word not was omitted from the 7th commandment, making it, Thou shalt commit adultery. There was the Discharge Bible, the Treacle Bible, the Standing Fishers Bible, the Charing Cross Bible, and the rest. Aziraphale had them all, even the very rarest, a Bible published in 1651 by the London publishing firm of Bilton and Skaggs. It had been the first of their 3 great publishing disasters. The book was commonly known as the Bugger All This Bible. The lengthy compositor's error, if such it may be called, occurs in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 48, verse 5. 2. And by the border of Dan, from the east side to the west side, a portion of for Asher. 3. And by the border of Asher, from the east side even unto the west side, a portion for Naphtali. And by the border of Naphtali, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Manasseh. 5. Bugger all this for a lark. I am sick to my heart of typesetting. Master Bilton is no gentleman, and Master Skaggs no more than a tight-fisted Southwark knobstick. I tell you, one day like this, everyone with half an ounce of sense should be out in the sunshine and not stuck here all the livelong day in this mouldy old By Our Lady workshop. String of swearing. And 6. And by the border of Ephron, from the east side even unto the west side, a portion for Reuben. Before I do a footnote, I'll show you what that looks like in case you want to pause that and read it with the funny spelling. Okay, now we're going for the footnote. The bugger-all this Bible was also noteworthy for having 27 verses in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, instead of the more usual 24. They followed verse 24, in which the King James Version reads, "So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way to the tree of life." And read 25. "And the Lord spake unto the angel that guarded the eastern gate, saying, Where is the flaming sword which was given unto thee? And the angel," 26, "and the angel said, I had it here only a moment ago. I must have put it down somewhere. Forget my own head next." 27, "And the Lord did not ask him again." It appears that these verses were inserted during the proof stage. In those days it was common practice for printers to hang proof sheets to the wooden beams outside their shops for the edification of the populace and some free proofreading. And since the whole print run was subsequently burned anyway, no one bothered to take up this matter with the nice Mr. Aziraphale, who ran the bookshop 2 doors along and was always so helpful with the translations, and whose handwriting was instantly recognisable. Bilton and Skagg's second great publishing disaster occurred in 1653. By a stroke of rare good fortune, they had obtained one of the famous Lost Quartos, the 3 Shakespeare plays never reissued in folio edition, and now totally lost to scholars and playgoers. Only their names have come down to us. This one was Shakespeare's earliest play, the comedy of Robin Hood, or the Forest of Sherwood. Footnote. The other 2 are The Trapping of the Mouse and Gold Diggers of 1589. Master Bilton had paid almost 6 guineas for the quarto and believed he could make nearly twice that much back on the hardcover folio alone. Then he lost it. Bilton and Skagg's third great publishing disaster was never entirely comprehensible to either of them. Everywhere you looked, books of prophecy were selling like crazy. The English edition of Nostradamus' Centuries had just gone into its 3rd printing, and 5 Nostradamuses, all claiming to be the only genuine one, were on triumphant signing tours. And Mother Shipton's collection of prophecies was sprinting out of the shops. Each of the great London publishers, there were 8 of them, had at least one book of prophecy on its list. Every single one of the books was wildly inaccurate, but their air of vague and generalized omnipotence made them immensely popular. They sold in their thousands and in their tens of thousands. "It is a license to print money," said Master Bilton to Master Skaggs. Footnote. Who had already had a few thoughts in that direction and spent the last years of his life in Newgate prison when he eventually put them into practice. "The public are crying out for such rubbish. We must straightway print a book of prophecy by some hag." The manuscript arrived at their door the next morning. The author's sense of timing, as always, was exact. Although neither Mr. Bilton nor Mr. Skaggs realised it, the manuscript they'd been sent was the sole prophetic work in all of human history to consist entirely of completely correct predictions concerning the following 340-odd years, being a precise and accurate description of the events that would culminate in Armageddon. It was on the money in every single detail. It was published by Bilton and Skaggs in September 1655, in good time for the Christmas trade. Footnote, another masterstroke of publishing genius, because Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Parliament had made Christmas illegal in 1654. And it was the first book printed in England to be remaindered. It didn't sell. Not even the copy in the tiny Lancashire shop with local author on a piece of cardboard next to it. The author of the book, one Agnes Nutter, was not surprised by this, but then it would have taken an awful lot to surprise Agnes Nutter. Anyway, she'd not written it for the sales, or the royalties, or even the fame. She'd written it for the single gratis copy of the book that an author was entitled to. No one knows what happened to the legions of unsold copies of her books. Certainly none remain in any museums or private collections. Even Aziraphale does not possess a copy, but would go weak in the knees at the thought of actually getting his exquisitely manicured hands on one. In fact, only one copy of Agnes Nutter's prophecies remained in the entire world. He was on a bookshelf about 40 miles away from where Crowley and Aziraphale were enjoying a rather good lunch, and metaphorically, it had just begun to tick. Okay, we'll do section 5 soon, and try and catch up with our lost days. I will see you again next time.